The words hung in the desert air like a gunshot's echo. Sarah's confession shattered the careful silence that had stretched between them since the stagecoach had disappeared into dust 3 hours ago. The loner rancher's weathered hands stopped mid-motion above the coffee pot, steam rising between them like the ghost of every lie she'd written in those desperate letters. She had traveled 800 miles to this God-forsaken ranch, carrying the weight of a dead husband's memory and the terror of being discovered. Now, watching his face turn to stone, she realized that sometimes the truth cuts deeper than any blade. And if you're looking for stories that reveal the raw courage it takes to start over, subscribe to discover what happens when two broken souls collide under the endless western sky. The silence stretched between them, like the vast expanse of desert that surrounded the ranch, heavy and unforgiving. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched the rancher's face, searching for any flicker of understanding in those steel-grey eyes that had seemed so kind when he'd helped her down from the stagecoach. The coffee pot remained suspended in his grip, forgotten, while steam continued to rise between them, like the ghost of every carefully crafted lie she'd penned in those desperate letters. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times during the long journey west, rehearsing the words that would explain why she had misled him, why she had let him believe she was something she wasn't. But now, standing in the crude kitchen of his isolated ranch house, with the weight of her dead husband's memory pressing against her chest like a stone, the rehearsed explanations crumbled to dust. The late afternoon sun slanted through the single window, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor, and in that golden light she could see the exact moment when his hope began to die. His name was Jacob, and she had learned from his letters that he was a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured grain for his horses. 3 years of solitude had carved deep lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of winters spent alone, of conversations held only with the wind and the endless sky. When he'd written to the matrimonial agency back east, his request had been simple: a woman who understood loss, someone who could find peace in the quiet spaces between words. Sarah had read those letters until the paper grew soft with handling, imagining herself into the life he described, a life where the past could be buried beneath the daily rhythms of ranch work and shared meals. She had convinced herself that her deception was small, that the difference between widow and virgin was merely a matter of degree, both states speaking to loneliness and the need for companionship. But standing here now, watching the careful hope drain from his face, she understood that she had stolen something precious from him, the right to choose her knowing the truth. The ranch house around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood the gravity of this moment. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied, the sound carrying across the empty landscape like a question without an answer. Sarah's traveling dress, once her finest, now hung limp and travel-stained, a reminder of the long journey that had brought her to this moment of reckoning. She had sold everything she owned to pay for the passage west, burning every bridge that might have led her back to the life she'd known. There was no returning now, no matter how this conversation ended, and that knowledge sat in her stomach like a cold stone. The rancher, Jacob, finally set the coffee pot down with deliberate care, the small sound echoing in the silence like a judgment being rendered. "You wrote that your husband died in the war," he said finally, his voice as level and controlled as still water. Each word was measured, careful, as if he were handling something fragile that might shatter if he spoke too quickly. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words, remembering the hours she had spent crafting that particular lie, how she had borrowed the grief of other women to make her deception believable. She had told him about a brief marriage cut short by tragedy, about learning to be strong in the face of loss, about understanding the value of a quiet life built on mutual respect rather than passion. Every word had been calculated to appeal to a man who had known his own share of disappointment, who sought companionship rather than romance. But now, faced with his steady gaze, she realized that her lies had been not just deception, but theft. She had stolen his right to know her truly, to choose her with full knowledge of who she was and what she brought to his isolated world. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were rejecting her presence. Through the window, she could see the endless expanse of his land, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional lonely tree, a landscape that promised both freedom and isolation in equal measure. This was to have been her sanctuary, the place where she could finally stop running from the shame that had driven her from everything she'd ever known. But sanctuary built on lies was no sanctuary at all, and she could feel it crumbling around her even as she stood there waiting for his judgment. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and she wondered if she would see another sunset from this window, or if she would be back on the road by morning, carrying her shame like a burden that grew heavier with each mile. The thought of returning to the world she'd fled made her stomach clench with fear, but the thought of staying where she wasn't wanted was somehow worse. Jacob moved to the window, his broad shoulders blocking the fading light, and for a long moment he stood there in silence, looking out at the land that was his whole world. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had learned to live with disappointment, who had made peace with solitude but had dared to hope for something more. "I asked for honesty," he said, not turning around. And Sarah felt those words like a physical blow, understanding that she had failed him in the most fundamental way possible. The distance between them felt vast now, measured not in feet but in the gulf between truth and deception, between what he had hoped for and what she had given him. She wanted to explain, to make him understand the desperation that had driven her to lie, but she knew that explanations would only make the betrayal worse, would only prove how calculated her deception had been. The silence that followed stretched like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Sarah watched Jacob's reflection in the window glass, seeing the way his shoulders had set into a rigid line, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. She had imagined this moment differently in her letters, had pictured herself as the grieving widow who would bring gentle comfort to his lonely existence, someone who understood loss and could help him heal from whatever wounds had driven him to seek a mail-order bride. Instead, she stood here as a fraud, her carefully constructed identity crumbling like a house built on sand. The weight of her deception pressed against her chest, making each breath feel labored, and she wondered how many other lies she would have to confess before this day was done. The kitchen around them felt charged with unspoken accusations, every shadow seeming to whisper of the trust she had broken before it had even had a chance to grow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard like restless spirits. The sound seemed to echo the turmoil in Sarah's heart, the way her carefully laid plans were being scattered by the force of truth. She had spent months preparing for this new life, learning to cook simple meals, practicing the skills she thought a rancher's wife would need, all while maintaining the fiction that she was a woman experienced in marriage and loss. But experience, she was learning, could not be borrowed or faked, and the gap between her imagined competence and her actual knowledge felt as wide as the desert that surrounded them. Jacob's ranch was more isolated than she had imagined, miles from the nearest neighbor, and the thought of being stranded here with a man who now had every reason to despise her made her feel more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The irony was not lost on her. She'd come west seeking escape from loneliness, only to find herself more isolated than ever. "Tell me about your husband," Jacob said finally, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts like a blade. He still hadn't turned around, still stood with his back to her, and somehow that made the question even more difficult to answer. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed, the words she had rehearsed so many times now feeling like ash on her tongue. How could she explain that there had been no husband, no tragic loss, no noble grief that had shaped her into the woman he thought he was getting? How could she tell him that her only experience with men had been the kind that left bruises on her soul, the kind that had driven her to flee in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate plan to reinvent herself? The truth felt too raw, too shameful to speak aloud. And yet she knew that more lies would only dig her grave deeper. The late afternoon sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and with each passing moment she felt her chances of redemption slipping away like sand through her fingers. "There was no husband," she whispered finally, the words barely audible even in the profound silence of the kitchen. She saw Jacob's reflection stiffen in the window, saw the way his head tilted slightly, as if he hadn't heard her correctly, and she forced herself to speak louder, to own the truth that would either save her or damn her completely. "There was never a husband, never a marriage, never any of the things I wrote about in my letters." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke, acrid and choking, and Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open, releasing years of carefully guarded shame. She had built her entire identity around the fiction of respectability, around the story of a woman who had loved and lost, rather than a woman who had simply been discarded, used, and forgotten. But standing here in this kitchen, with the weight of Jacob's disappointment pressing down on her like a physical force, she realized that the truth, however ugly, was the only foundation on which anything real could be built. The wind outside grew stronger, howling around the corners of the house like a living thing in pain, and Sarah found herself thinking of all the other women who had made this same journey west, carrying their own secrets and desperate hopes. How many of them had lied in their letters, had reinvented themselves to escape the shame or poverty or violence that had marked their lives back east. How many had stood in kitchens like this one, watching their carefully constructed facades crumble under the weight of truth. The thought should have been comforting, should have made her feel less alone in her deception, but instead it only made her feel more ashamed, as if she were part of a long tradition of women who had learned that survival sometimes required the sacrifice of honesty. She thought of the matrimonial agency back in Chicago, of the woman who had helped her craft her letters, who had assured her that a little creative editing was not only acceptable but necessary in the business of finding a husband. But that woman had never had to stand in a kitchen like this one, had never had to watch hope die in a good man's eyes. Jacob finally turned around, and Sarah saw that his face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, saw the way his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. When he looked at her, she felt exposed, as if he could see through all her remaining pretenses to the frightened, damaged woman beneath. "Why?" he asked, and that single word carried the weight of every question she had been dreading, every accusation she had been expecting. Why had she lied? Why had she come here under false pretenses? Why had she thought she could build a life on a foundation of deception? The questions swirled around her like the wind outside, and she found herself struggling to find an answer that would make sense to a man who had clearly never been desperate enough to trade his integrity for the promise of safety. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were rejecting her presence, and she wondered if this was how it felt to drown, to feel the water closing over your head while you struggled uselessly against the current. "Because I was afraid," she said finally, the words torn from her throat like a confession under torture, and in that moment she felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble into dust. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had opened in the earth itself, deep and treacherous, filled with the echoes of words that could never be taken back. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still gripping the wooden frame, as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling into that abyss, while Thomas remained motionless at the table, his coffee growing cold in the cup that trembled almost imperceptibly in his weathered hands. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and inescapable, seeping into every corner of the small cabin, until it seemed the very walls had absorbed her confession and would hold it forever. She could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, heavy as the summer sun that beat down mercilessly on the parched earth outside, and she knew that in this moment, everything she had hoped to build here was balanced on the edge of a knife. The wind outside had stilled completely, as if the entire world were holding its breath, waiting to see whether this fragile thing between them would survive the storm of truth that had finally broken free. In the distance, a coyote's lonely howl pierced the silence, a sound so mournful it seemed to echo the breaking of her own heart. Thomas set his cup down with deliberate care, the small sound seeming to crack through the tension, like the first stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of consequence spreading outward in ever-widening circles. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seemed so kind when he'd first helped her down from the stagecoach, now held something she couldn't quite read. Disappointment, perhaps, or anger, or something deeper and more complex that made her stomach clench with dread. "A widow," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word on his tongue, and she could hear in his voice the careful control of a man who had learned to master his emotions through years of solitude and hardship. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper now, carved by more than just the relentless sun and wind of this harsh land, and she realized that her deception had aged him in the space of a heartbeat. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the rough wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on stone, and she watched as he moved to the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dying light that painted the sky the color of old blood. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it, and the words fell between them like stones into a deep well. "Tell me about him," he said, and the simple request hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her gasping for air that suddenly seemed too thin to sustain life. She had prepared herself for anger, for accusations, for the righteous fury of a man who had been deceived, but this quiet request for the truth was somehow worse than any rage could have been. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she moved unsteadily to the chair, across from where he had been sitting, sinking into it as if her bones had turned to water, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white as bleached bone. The memories she had tried so hard to bury came rushing back like a flood, breaking through a dam, carrying with them all the pain and loss she had thought she could leave behind in that other life, that other world that seemed as distant now as a half-remembered dream. She could see James's face as clearly as if he were standing before her, young and handsome and so full of life, his dark eyes dancing with laughter as he spun her around their tiny parlor, promising her a future that had been cut short by a Confederate bullet on a battlefield, whose name she could barely bring herself to speak. The words came slowly at first, halting and broken, like water seeping through cracks in a dam that was slowly giving way. "His name was James," she began, and even saying his name aloud felt like opening an old wound that had never properly healed, the pain as fresh and sharp as it had been on that terrible day when the telegram had arrived with its stark, brutal message. "We were married for 3 years before the war took him, 3 years that felt like a lifetime, and yet passed like a single breath. And when he left for the fighting, I thought it would be for a few months at most, that he would come home to me with stories to tell, and we would grow old together in the little house he had built for us with his own hands." The tears came then, hot and bitter, spilling down her cheeks like rain on parched earth, and she made no effort to stop them, knowing that this moment required nothing less than complete honesty, no matter how much it cost her. Thomas remained at the window, his back to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the windowsill, as if he were holding himself upright through sheer force of will. The light outside was fading rapidly now, painting the room in shades of grey and shadow, and she felt as if she were confessing her sins in a cathedral made of loneliness and regret. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the profound silence of the cabin, every word rang out like a bell tolling for the dead. I waited for him for 2 years after the war ended, telling myself that he was just delayed, that he would come walking up the path any day with that crooked smile of his and sweep me into his arms as if no time had passed at all, she continued, the words pouring out of her now like water from a broken vessel, carrying with them all the hope and desperation she had carried for so long. But the other wives, the ones whose husbands had come home, they looked at me with such pity, and I could see in their eyes that they knew what I refused to accept, that James was never coming home, that he was lying in some unmarked grave in a field far from here, and that I was clinging to a ghost. The admission felt like tearing out a piece of her soul, but she pressed on, knowing that if she stopped now, she would never find the courage to finish. Thomas turned from the window then, his face a mask of shadows in the dim light, and she could see something in his expression that might have been understanding, or perhaps just the recognition of a pain that matched his own. The silence that followed her words was different now, not the hostile quiet of anger, but the profound stillness that comes when two wounded souls recognize each other across the vast emptiness of their separate griefs. In that moment, she felt something shift between them, fragile as a spider's web, but real nonetheless. And she dared to hope that perhaps her honesty had not destroyed everything after all. I came here because I couldn't bear to be that woman anymore. The widow who haunted the general store like a ghost, buying supplies for one and pretending that someday there might be two again. She finished, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if the act of confession had somehow freed something inside her that had been trapped for far too long. I wanted to be someone new, someone who could build a life instead of mourning one. And when I saw your advertisement in the paper, it felt like a door opening in a wall I thought was solid stone. She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since her confession began, and what she saw there made her heart skip like a stone across water. Not the condemnation she had feared, but something deeper and more complex, a recognition that perhaps they were both refugees from lives that had been shattered beyond repair. The last light of day faded completely as they stood there looking at each other across the small space that suddenly felt vast as the prairie itself. And in the gathering darkness, she could almost believe that redemption was possible, that two broken people might somehow find a way to heal each other's wounds and build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate sorrows. The darkness that settled over the cabin felt different from the hostile silence that had preceded it, softer somehow, like a blanket drawn over the raw edges of their mutual pain, and Margaret found herself able to breathe again for the first time since her confession had torn through the careful facade she had constructed. Thomas moved away from the window with slow, deliberate steps, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor as he lit the oil lamp that sat on the small table beside his chair, the warm yellow light pushing back the shadows and creating a circle of intimacy that seemed to hold them both like gentle hands. She watched his face in the lamplight, noting the way the harsh lines around his eyes had softened slightly, as if her honesty had somehow given him permission to lower his own defenses. And she realized that perhaps she was not the only one in this room who carried secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. The flame flickered slightly in a draught she couldn't feel, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and in those shifting patterns of light and dark, she thought she could see the ghosts of all the words they had not yet spoken, all the truths that still lay buried beneath years of careful self-protection. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more vulnerable, as if her confession had cracked something open inside him that had been sealed shut for far too long. "I put that advertisement in the paper because I was tired of talking to the wind," he said, settling back into his chair with a heaviness that spoke of more than just physical weariness, and she could hear in his words the echo of her own desperate loneliness, the same aching need for human connection that had driven her to answer his call for a wife. This land, it's beautiful in its way, but it's hard, and it makes a man hard too if he's not careful, and I could feel myself turning into something I didn't recognize, something cold and distant as the mountains on the horizon. He paused, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if seeking warmth from its ceramic surface, and she could see in his profile the boy he must have been once, before life had carved its harsh lessons into his features with the relentless patience of wind and weather. The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm, fragile but real, and she felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, as if a knot that had been tied too tightly was finally beginning to give way. Outside, the night sounds of the prairie began their ancient symphony, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the grass, the whisper of wind through the eaves, and she realized that for the first time since arriving at this remote place, she felt like she might actually belong here. "I never married before," he continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the circle of lamplight, as if he were speaking to the darkness itself rather than to her, and she could hear the weight of that admission in every carefully chosen word. Came close once, back in Missouri, but she took one look at this place and decided she'd rather marry a shopkeeper in town than follow me out here to the edge of nowhere, and I can't say I blamed her for it. The bitterness in his voice was old and well-worn, like a stone polished smooth by years of handling, and Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy for this man who had chosen solitude over the risk of further rejection. She wanted to reach across the small space between them and touch his hand, to offer some gesture of comfort or understanding, but something held her back. Perhaps the knowledge that they were both still too raw, too newly exposed for such intimacy. The lamp flame guttered slightly, sending shadows dancing across his face, and in that moment she saw him not as the stern, silent rancher who had met her at the stagecoach, but as a man who had been shaped by disappointment and loss just as surely as she had been. The realization that they were both survivors of different kinds of battles made something shift inside her, a recognition that perhaps her deception had been born not of malice, but of the same desperate hope that had led him to place that advertisement in the first place. When your letter came, talking about wanting a fresh start, about leaving the past behind and building something new, it felt like maybe I wasn't the only one who believed that two people could create something better together than either could manage alone, he said. And now he did look at her, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like still water under stars. "But I need to know that what we're building is real, that it's based on truth and not on the stories we tell ourselves to make the loneliness bearable." His words hit her like a gentle but insistent rain, soaking through all her carefully constructed defenses and reaching the parched earth of her heart, and she felt tears spring to her eyes again. Not the bitter tears of grief this time, but something cleaner, more hopeful. She understood what he was asking of her, and more than that, she understood that he was offering her something precious in return. The chance to be truly known, to be accepted not despite her flaws and failures, but because of them, because they made her human and real and worthy of love. The silence that followed his words was not empty but full, pregnant with possibility, and she felt as if they were standing together on the edge of something vast and unknown, preparing to take a leap that would either destroy them both or carry them to a place neither could reach alone. "I want that too," she whispered, the words coming from some deep place inside her that she had thought was dead and buried with James. And as she spoke them, she felt something like hope beginning to unfurl in her chest, like a flower opening to the sun. "I want to build something real with you, something that can weather whatever storms come. But I need you to know that I'm not the woman I was when I wrote that letter. I'm not sure I ever was." Brigi, the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. But instead of falling, she felt herself floating, suspended by the possibility that honesty might be the foundation upon which they could build something lasting and true. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and she could see in his posture an openness that had not been there before, a willingness to listen and understand that made her brave enough to continue. The lamp flame steadied, casting a warm, golden light that seemed to wrap around them both like a blessing, and she realized that this moment, this fragile, honest moment, was the real beginning of whatever they might become together. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, more certain, as if the act of confession had somehow restored something vital that she had thought was lost forever. "I don't know how to be a wife to a stranger, how to love someone I barely know, but I know how to be honest, and I know how to work hard, and I know how to hope even when hope seems foolish," she said. And with each word, she felt herself becoming more real, more present, more alive than she had been in years. "If you can accept that, if you can accept me as I am, with all my grief and mistakes and desperate need for a second chance, then maybe we can figure out the rest together, one day at a time." The offer hung between them like a prayer, fragile and precious, and she held her breath as she waited for his response, knowing that his next words would determine whether she had found a home at last, or whether she would be traveling on again, carrying her loneliness like a stone in her chest. But when he smiled, a small, tentative smile that transformed his entire face, she felt something inside her settle into place, like a key turning in a lock, and she knew that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The morning came slowly to the prairie, creeping across the endless grassland like a cautious animal emerging from its den, and Margaret woke to find herself still curled in the chair where she had fallen asleep sometime during the long night of talking and listening and learning the shape of each other's wounds. The cabin was filled with the soft grey light that comes just before dawn, and she could hear Thomas moving quietly in the kitchen area, the gentle sounds of someone trying not to wake a sleeping household. And the simple domesticity of it made her heart clench with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the first stirring of something deeper and more dangerous. She had dreamed of James again, but for the first time in years, the dream had not been a nightmare. Instead, she had seen him standing in a field of golden wheat, smiling that crooked smile she remembered so well, and when she had tried to run to him, he had shaken his head gently and pointed behind her, where Thomas stood waiting with patient eyes and work-worn hands. The dream had felt like a benediction, like permission to let go of the past and reach for the future that was being offered to her with such careful, tentative hope. She stretched slowly, working the kinks out of muscles that had grown stiff from sleeping in the chair, and realized that for the first time since arriving at this remote place, she felt like she might actually be home. Thomas looked up as she stirred, and she could see in his face the same careful hope that she felt blooming in her own chest, fragile as a wildflower pushing through hard-packed earth, but real nonetheless. "Coffee's ready," he said simply, but there was something in his voice that had not been there the day before, a warmth, a gentleness, as if her honesty had somehow given him permission to show her the man he was beneath the protective shell of solitude he had built around himself. She accepted the cup he offered with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming realization that she was being offered a gift she had never dared to hope for, the chance to be known completely and accepted anyway. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, and as she sipped it, she watched Thomas move around the small space with an economy of motion that spoke of years of living alone, and she found herself imagining how it might feel to share this space with him, to learn the rhythm of his days, and find her own place within them. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer fraught with the tension of unspoken secrets, and she realized that perhaps this was what peace felt like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding, the knowledge that she was no longer carrying her burdens alone. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, as he settled into his own chair with his coffee, and she could hear in his voice the careful consideration of a man who chose his words as deliberately as he chose his actions. "About what you said last night, about wanting to build something real together, and I think maybe we've been going about this all wrong from the start." He paused, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of his cup, and she could see in them a vulnerability that made her breath catch in her throat. "Maybe instead of trying to be husband and wife right away, we should start by being friends. Real friends, who know each other's stories and can trust each other with the truth." The suggestion hit her like a cool breeze on a sweltering day, bringing relief she hadn't even known she needed, and she felt some of the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders begin to ease. The idea of friendship, of companionship without the weight of expectations and obligations she didn't know how to fulfill, felt like a gift beyond measure. She nodded slowly, afraid to speak for fear that words might somehow break the fragile magic of this moment, this offer of grace that she had never dared to hope for. "I'd like that," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But in the quiet of the cabin, the words rang out like a bell, clear and true and full of promise. "I'd like to be your friend, Thomas, and maybe someday, when we both know who we really are and what we really want, we can decide if we want to be something more." The admission felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow, and she could see in his face that he understood what she was offering, not just her presence but her trust, her willingness to be vulnerable and real and human in all the messy, complicated ways that mattered. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And she realized that this was what hope felt like, not the desperate, clinging hope she had carried for so long, but something quieter and more sustainable, something that could grow slowly and steadily like the grass on the prairie, putting down deep roots that could weather any storm. The future stretched out before them like an unwritten page, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time in years, she was not afraid to turn that page and see what story they might write together. As the morning light grew stronger, filling the cabin with warmth and brightness, Margaret felt something inside her chest unfurl like wings, and she realized that she was no longer the broken woman who had stepped off the stagecoach just days before. She was still a widow, still carrying the scars of loss and grief, but she was also something new, a woman who had found the courage to tell the truth and been met not with condemnation, but with understanding, not with rejection, but with acceptance. Thomas reached across the small space between their chairs and offered her his hand, palm up, and when she placed her own hand in his, she felt the calluses and scars that spoke of years of hard work and harder choices. And she knew that she was touching not just his skin, but his story, his truth, his willingness to trust her with the tender places in his heart. "Friends," he said simply, and the word fell between them like a seed planted in fertile ground, full of potential and promise. "Friends," she agreed, and as their hands clasped in the golden morning light, she felt the first stirring of something that might someday grow into love. Not the desperate, consuming love she had known with James, but something quieter and deeper, something built on the solid foundation of truth and trust and the shared understanding that they were both survivors, both fighters, both worthy of the second chance they were offering each other. The prairie wind whispered through the eaves of the cabin, carrying with it the scent of wild grass and endless sky. And Margaret closed her eyes and let herself believe for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was meant to be.